Hello, my name is Deborah, and I'm here with Ashley. Today we're going to talk to you about chapters 8 and 9 of Paul Heppner's book, Research, Design, and Counseling. I will cover chapter 8, Population Issues, Who We Study Matters, and Ashley will cover chapter 9, Diverse Perspectives, Conceptual, and Methodological Considerations. There's a lot of information to cover, so let's get started. There are four key population issues to consider when planning a research study. What types of participants to use, how many participants to study, how to treat different types of participants in design and analysis, and to what extent the results are generalizable. Sampling theory provides the foundation for understanding the process and the implications of selecting participants for a particular study. It involves selecting samples that reflect larger or total populations. Population is a well-defined set of people. Sample is a subset of the population. Technically, we're looking at the observations in the sample, which are taken from the set of observations that constitute the population. Sampling theory is important because inferences about populations are made on the basis of samples selected from populations. The validity of the inferences depends on how well the sample represents the population. This is representativeness. The process involves three steps: define target population, create participant pool, and select participants. Representativeness is a basic principle of sampling theory. In this illustration, the large bell curve represents the total population, with mu indicating the mean. The two small bell curves represent samples. To determine representativeness, the mean of each sample is examined in relation to the mean of the total population. The mean of sample A is close to the population mean. It is representative. The mean of sample B is far from the population mean. Therefore, it is not representative. Larger samples are more likely to be representative than smaller samples. A random sample is like pulling names from a hat. Each observation in the population has an equal chance of being selected. The hat contains an equal number of names for each gender. In a biased sample, all observations in the population do not have an equal chance of being selected. The hat contains more names of one gender than the other. Random selection is almost always an impossibility in applied research. This is because in the real world, the population parameter is unknown, and often the researcher has only one sample. Selected participants are randomly assigned to two groups, treatment and control, to test the research hypothesis. The result is analyzed against the null hypothesis. The null hypothesis is based on the fundamental assumption that participants in the treatment group and the no treatment group are randomly selected from hypothetical treatment and no treatment populations. Therefore, if the sample groups and their respective populations are tested, the mean outcome scores of both groups would be equal, which means the treatment had no significant impact. Thus, the decision is made to reject the null. This does not mean the null is false. It means that the obtained results would be very unusual if the null had been true. By deciding to reject the null and accepting the alternative, the researcher is making an inference about the population of observations based on the sample scores. Target population is typically defined in terms of the characteristics of people to which the results of the study will be generalized. Heterogeneous populations contain a wide variety of characteristics to which the results may be generalizable. Homogeneous populations have limited generalizability. The participant pool consists of people who fit the definition and are accessible. Restricting the participant pool to a subset of all possible participants introduces various kinds of bias. However, biases will exist in virtually all samples. The researcher needs evidence to support the contention that restricting the participant pool does not affect the results. Selecting participants by random sample is ideal. However, there are still issues. Pre-tests and post-tests offer a possible solution and help the researcher identify strong candidates for the study. When random selection is not possible, the good enough principle applies. The validity of the sample can be inferred from a hypothetical population resembling the sample, much like the null set example. A chi-square test can be used to analyze the generalizability of the sample. As the number of participants increases, so does the probability that the sample is representative of the population. Power is the ability of a statistical sample to detect relationships or differences. It answers the question, is the sample size sufficient? Statistical power is the probability of rejecting the null hypothesis when the alternative is true. Here is a list of the factors that influence power. Pause here and remember some principles that are important for the next section. Then we'll look at how population issues can be incorporated into factorial design. External validity answers the question of whether the treatment has the same effect on all participants. In this example, it does not. Males responded better to treatment 1 and females responded better to treatment 2. Therefore, the results are not generalizable across gender. The consideration of person variables can be vital to the proper understanding of the results and should be considered when planning the target population and sample. In the factorial design approach to external validity, the choice of variables related to persons, settings, or times requires several considerations. Here are just a few. I leave you with a brief summary of Chapter 8, and with that I turn you over to Ashley.
Thank you, Deborah. My name is Ashley Van Bemmelen, and I'm going to be discussing Chapter 9 in the Research and Counseling text. This chapter is going to focus on diverse perspectives in counseling research. We're going to talk through multiculturalism, why it's important and how we define it, how to best operationalize terms within multicultural research, research design concerns, methodological challenges, measurement issues, and finally implications for our research and for the discussion sections of a research paper. Let's begin with the topic of multiculturalism. There's not going to be one singular definition. We're going to consider this topic with more of a broad scope. But first we want to ask, why is it really important? So I think to begin, we want to acknowledge that multicultural competency is not just a social issue. It's a biblical and theological issue. If every person, regardless of age, race, gender, sexual orientation, ability, and so on, is truly created in the image of God, if we really believe that, then no group deserves less consideration than another. Unfortunately, history has not always agreed with this biblical concept, and groups like whites, educated, males have been prioritized. As counselors, we must do better. Considerations about multicultural perspectives are fairly new in our field. It wasn't until about 1999 that this topic began to be addressed in psychological research. Before 1999, multicultural variables were often considered nuisance variables. But since that 1999 date, the field has greatly expanded with journals focused on multicultural issues, a handbook of multicultural psychology, and divisions of the ACA dedicated to diversity. Now, with this important emphasis on multicultural topics and understanding, we have to decide how to define or operationalize the term. So broadly, multiculturalism includes the topics on the screen today. All of these are critical aspects of an individual's ethnic, racial, and personal identity. So let's discuss why operationalizing definitions are important for counseling and psychological research. Without them, populations can be marginalized, misunderstood, and even overlooked entirely. Without definition and attention to multicultural variables, some research might not be as generalizable as we think. So it's going to be important to operationalize terms like race, ethnicity, and culture. Several differing definitions are presented in your text. As you read through those, I think this Venn diagram is helpful in identifying that these multicultural variables are separate but overlapping constructs. And when race and culture overlap, a worldview is created. When culture and ethnicity overlap, values are born. When ethnicity and race overlap, a phenotype is identifiable. And when all three overlap, an identity is formed. And this identity is often a core piece of someone's self-identity and perception of power or importance in the world. And then there's terms like sex, gender, and sexuality. Historically, sex and gender have been used interchangeably. And again, there's a real lack of consensus as far as what some of these terms mean in our research. There's also social class, socioeconomic status, and social status. Terms that struggle to find definition. In a study looking at 20 years of counseling research, there were over 400 different definitions of social class. So it's going to be important anytime we're creating research to be very specific about how we're defining these variables. And this leads us into research design considerations and methodological challenges. Is our research theory-driven or more descriptive in nature? Are we using distal explanations like race, culture, ethnicity, where somebody can check a box on a survey? Or more proximal descriptions like racial identity, worldview, or values? What are the threats to internal validity, like selection, local history, attrition, testing, and maturation? And how are we conceptualizing our research question? Have we looked at all of the existing literature about our target population, existing theory that's been used, and our personal knowledge of the target population? And then how are we considering and hopefully moving away from the early reliance on comparative research strategies, where minority populations were simply compared to a majority population without a basis in much theory or research design? As we move into building our study, we want to consider how we recruit our sample and what data collection issues we might run into. So we want to think through who's studied. Does the researcher have perseverance and passion to study a diverse population, even when it becomes challenging? Are we able to make social connections with the target population and build relationships? Are we able to make explicit how our research is going to benefit the target group? That we're not doing research for the sake of doing research, but for the betterment of a community. And when we're done, how do we give back to that community through volunteering, maybe a presentation on the research, or some other way in which we could share the information we've gained? Measurement issues also need to be considered, as the strength of the study is dependent upon instruments used. Instruments need to be appropriately sensitive with acceptable estimates of validity and reliability for the target population. And if they're not, we need to flesh out in our research how these instruments are going to work with a differing target population. And then we want to consider construct validity as we try to make general application of assessments that have been normed on diverse populations. And finally, we want to consider how we're going to interpret or discuss the findings of our study. The discussion section of our research article is where this is going to take place, and there are several difficulties in accomplishing this task, including limited previous research to compare our study to, difficulties with previous research being normed on a dominant culture, and then even journal editors or reviewers asking us to stretch or bend findings to fit a theoretical model. In order to ensure the quality of our interpretation or discussion section, it's helpful to ask members of the target group to review the findings and provide a first-hand understanding of the research that's been done. And finally, to sum it up, There are a number of methodological issues that need to be considered when we're studying diverse populations. As researchers, we have a responsibility to operationalize the terms we use so that they're understandable 5, 10, and 20 years down the road. We have a responsibility to consider diverse populations when we conduct research and gain competencies where they might be lacking for researchers. We also have a responsibility to ensure that the research we do benefits the diverse cultures that we study. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I have attached both Deborah and my contact information. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Thank you.